Alright, hey guys, welcome back to another video. So just last night, the Australian Chess Championships wrapped up. I want to get right into the round 1 recap, but for those of you who do not know, the Australian Championships is held every 2 years. Every odd year, we have the Australian Open Chess Championships, which is like an open tournament anyone can play, and every even year, we have the Australian Chess Championships, and also the reserves for people who do not make the cut quite, and the cut is basically 2150 ACF, the national range here in Australia, is sort of the minimum, and there are some exceptions where, you know, if we have a promising junior, they can get in, like I did when I was younger actually. But basically, it is one of the stronger tournaments in the year in Australia. But actually, if you are looking at the field, compared to previous editions of the event, where, you know, we have several of our grandmasters playing, a lot of like 2400 plus players, this year's actually was quite weak in comparison if we sort of go through. As you can see, I am the 12th seed here. There are 28 players in the field. So I'm sitting around somewhere in the middle with my incredibly low FIDE rating of 2125. The lowest has been for quite a while. I discussed this in my last video, the video I took before I went to Adelaide to play in this tournament. But I felt like coming into this tournament, it would be sort of a good opportunity to sort of prove myself that I am actually stronger than my rating, and I thought this tournament would be a great chance to do so because it's 11 rounds, it's a pretty close field, you're going to get the opportunity, or at least you should, to play some stronger opposition. But just for some context surrounding the tournament, this was a 10-day tournament actually. I think there was one rest day in the middle of the tournament, there were 2 double round days, and then there were 7 days where we just played 1 game a day, and you know, like, that's pretty comfortable playing schedule actually, since, you know, in Australia especially, we're used to playing like at least 2 games of 90 plus 30 a day. We even have one psychopathic tournament here in Sydney called the New South Wales Open, where we have 3 games of 90 plus 30 on the second day of the tournament. Who decided that was a sane idea? I do not know, but we do have that. And also another very strange thing surrounding this tournament was that we couldn't actually like drink or eat in the playing hall. We were, you know, the tournament was held at some school. It was like in the gym of that school that was like, you know, newly renovated or something like that, and they didn't want the gym floors to be ruined, so we weren't allowed to actually like eat, which is, I don't know, I guess that's feeling normal. But drink water is like, you know, that's pretty like insane, right? So if you had to drink water, you actually had to go outside of the gym, walk like 30 seconds or something to go drink your water like that. Kind of weird, right? But anyways, getting right down to business, the person who I ended up playing for the first round ended up being this junior, Iker Hernandez Mendez. He's from Western Australia and has a peak FIDE rating, I think, of like 1900, but seen around 1800 at the moment. And I ended up getting the white pieces against him, which meant I was going to start with 1d4. I was pretty sure actually a couple hours beforehand that I was going to be playing Iker, but I was not sure whether I was going to have the white or black pieces, because they only released the official pairings right before the round pretty much started. And what I did notice about Iker was, especially with white, he liked to play a lot of like tricky openings. For example, I noticed against Sicilian, he liked to go for the Smith-Morrow Gambit. So I had a feeling also against like d4, he'd probably go for something maybe like fairly tactical and tricky. And that's basically what he ended up doing. He ended up going for the modern Benoni after the following moves: take, d6. And there are many good options against Benoni. You could, for example, go for like e4, and after g6 go for a very aggressive setup in the center. But personally, the line that I like to play, and the line that I've been playing since I was a kid pretty much, is this line where you go knight f3 and after g6 bishop f4. And the whole idea of this line is to basically put this bishop on this kind of no-win square where it puts pressure on the d6 point. And instead of putting the pawn on e4 very often, you're actually going to put the pawn on e3, which makes it a little bit more difficult for black to obtain counterplay, because very often in the Benoni, black's counterplay is going to somehow revolve around attacking the e4 point very often. But if the pawn is on e3, that actually makes it a little bit more difficult in many situations for black to obtain counterplay. So after a bit of a think, my opponent ended up playing bishop g7. I'm not sure whether this indicated he was already unfamiliar with bishop f4. I would assume if he's familiar with the Benoni, he has seen it before, but there is also an option for black to go a6 here. And basically the point is to basically invite white to play a4 to stop black from playing b5. It is also worth noting there are some extra options where white can play, say, like knight d2, allowing b5 or also e4 and allowing b5 in this fashion. And this setup with e4 in particular will seem a bit strange, since I just said that the idea in going for this whole setup is to put the pawn on e3, not e4. But when black plays a6, we're sort of saying that, like, okay, because that's not like a developing move, we can afford to, you know, actually say that's maybe a waste of tempi and sort of break away from our normal development scheme, you could say. So while a6 is definitely playable, generally from what I've noticed, it seems like the trend is heading towards more bishop g7 these days. I think when I was a kid at least, this sort of was considered a bit inaccurate, because it was thought that white actually had this very annoying check of queen a4, and that basically, if you think about it, well, if you notice what our bishop is doing in f4, right, it's attacking the pawn, and after the bishop has moved, it is no longer defending that. So if you block with the knight, for example, that is indeed a free pawn. So people usually went bishop d7, and after queen b3, now both the d6 and b7 pawns are hanging. And for a long time, it was just like, you know, people would play queen c7, and this position was basically very passive after e4, castles, knight d2. If you go bishop e2, I believe there's some issues you might run into with like the bishop g4 pin. I think there's like a slightly more accurate move, or it might be like knight h5, I think, bishop e3, a6, a4, and then bishop g4, and basically the bishop is going to be trading itself off for the knight. And that's kind of important because in the modern Benoni, the knight squared bishop is a very problematic piece, which very often struggles to find a good square, which is why knight d2 is better. And now if the bishop ever tries coming to g4, we're just going to kick it away with f3. There's not going to be any pin there. That actually makes this position already very difficult to play for black. And one nice tactical idea, which I've had in quite a few of my online games growing up, is this line where black tries to go f5, takes, and they basically want to get an f4 and trap our bishop. And if it's not for our next few moves, basically black would be doing fine. But we have a very nice idea of going bishop e2, f4. And if you'd like to try to pause the video actually and try and figure out what white's whole idea is, I'd suggest you to try and figure that out. But basically the point is that, you know, we're not going to just take, because then this position, you know, we are technically up a pawn, but after just like knight a6, black has a lot of compensation because our dark squares are just very weak, and also our king is having a tough time castling. We might need to spend another tempi move in our bishop to castle kingside, or we castle long, and I mean that's just very risky because black's you know, queenside pawns are going to stampede over here and absolutely run us over. So the correct idea is actually after f4 to go bishop takes d5, and one of the big ideas is that if d takes e5, we get d6 check and we simply win their queen. And pretty much if they play queen takes e5, we're not going to take b7, we're going to take h5 now. And while you could say it's similar to the other variation that we're also missing our dark square bishop in this position, it's a little bit different, I would say, because our kingside structure is a lot more intact. We don't have that sort of weak pawn on e3. I don't really think black has much compensation at all. White rather is essentially just a pawn up. So you might be thinking then, like, what is wrong with queen a4 check if this line is very promising? The problem basically is that after b5, this is a sort of, I'm not sure, like, modern gambit line that's been around for probably like 20 or so years, but really only because of the influence of engines has this really been proven viable. And basically I'm just not a big fan of like these variations where black gains a bunch of tempi, and yes, white's a pawn up, but even if you analyze it with the engine, it's very difficult to find any advantage, and you always run the risk when you play this sort of variation really getting killed out of the opening. And especially considering, like, if it's sort of like I risk being killed but I'm like objectively better, that's a slightly different situation. But if it's like I risk being killed and I'm not even, you know, better in trying to, like, you know, go for this whole pawn grab thing, it's sort of like, why am I even going for it in the first place? And also there is knight takes b5, but it's sort of been shown after all these moves that black is actually doing fairly okay. White's pawns don't actually mean a whole lot. Black is even actually gives up another extra piece because white's development kind of looks like shit, and basically black's gonna win back the piece at some point, probably the knight in d2, and is doing okay. So that is basically a long-winded way of saying that in this position after bishop f4, you know, a6 is a thing, but bishop g7 is more trendy, and I played h3 in this position instead of queen a4 check. I could also probably go for e3, but you always have to watch out for knight h5 stuff and black trying to win your bishop, so I go h3, castles, e3, and reach a pretty standard setup where now in this position my opponent goes a6, a4, and we sort of reach our first real crossroads of the game where black has numerous options to pursue. I won't really go too in depth into all of them, but the one my opponent ended up picking in the game, and maybe at least according to modern theory, is not so great as this one with rook e8, and now I go not bishop e2, because then that would actually allow knight e4, and you have to be quite careful after this sort of exchange, because like if you try and kick the rook out, it's probably just going to come to b4, and they're putting a lot of pressure on your position. Not really a whole lot of fun in my opinion, which is why after again a4 rook e8, what I actually did in this position is I played knight d2 first before I go bishop e2. It's very common in these bishop f4 lines to prevent this whole knight e4 thing, and now I'm sort of asking black how they going to develop, and they end up playing knight d7, a very normal looking developing move. But of course you might be thinking, what happens if I go bishop takes d6? And the answer is just that, you know, black's gonna go knight b6 actually, and essentially if you go takes, they're gonna take on d5 with one of the knights, and you might sort of think that white's a pawn up, but actually I think black has more than enough compensation, and you know, the center's open, now development isn't so great. This is sort of a position that you actually probably want to avoid. I remembered that, and I instead played bishop e2. And now we have knight e5 from the opponent, which was the whole idea of knight e7, to try and bring the knight to a more central square. And ideally, if possible, if castles, black probably wants to play knight fd7 to regroup their other knights, and then play something like f5, g5, and start expanding on the king side. So in view of that, even though castles is actually the more common move in the position, I played bishop h2, which is a move I've known since I was a kid actually. And basically the idea is just that if knight of d7, you go f4 and you sort of just trap the knight. They can maybe try and pretend that they have something after the sequence, but I don't really buy it. But yeah, I did play bishop h2, and now my opponent really had to sort of think. It didn't seem like he was super comfortable in all these bishop f4 lines. Maybe he's never really studied them properly before. But the idea that I quite vividly remember is black trying to go for some sort of g5 push, and the basic reasoning is that, you know, they just want to try and make use of the drawback of bishop h2, which is that our bishop is no longer guarding the king side. And you might think g5 is quite anti-positional, but the Benoni is also quite an anti-positional opening. Very often they are willing to take these sort of risks in exchange for like very dynamic counterplay, in this case on the king side after like castles g4. And, you know, I wasn't like terribly scared of this, but I just thought like, you know, this is probably like a logical approach that black can take in this sort of position. However, what ended up happening in the game was rook b8, playing on the other side of the board, actually maybe angling for some sort of b5 idea, maybe just sacrificing the pawn, since like if you go bishop d7, the problem is if I just castle, which I did in the game, if you go bishop d7, you just sort of get your knight trapped again. This is the whole idea behind the bishop h2 move, and shows one of the issues in the Benoni actually, where, you know, very often, you know, your pieces just have a difficult time sort of finding good squares because of the space disadvantage you incurred early on. And another thing I also realized during the game was that, you know, if black tries to go g5, like a move earlier, g5 was quite decent, because one thing you have to note is that after f4 here, this isn't really viable, because after takes, e takes f4 rather, you can't really do this because knight d3 check, and you can't take because of the pin, right? And this is looking like not so great. I mean, maybe the knight can take. Actually, I'm not completely sure whether it can, because maybe it just sort of gets trapped. But I imagine there's some sort of tactical idea here with the knight so deep into white's camp. So the problem is, however, is that after bishop h2, rook b8, castles, now g5, which my opponent did not play, by the way. He did go for g5 later in sort of similar circumstances, though. Now with f4, you have to notice that after takes, e takes f4, the knight cannot come to d3 because it just hangs a piece, because our king is castled. And also I should note, it's very important you want to take back the pawn. If you take back the knight, the bishop rather, then this knight can't really be kicked out of e5 easily. Black has a very sort of strong grip over the square. You never really want to exchange your bishop for the knight unless you have really good reason to. But okay, in the game what we ended up having was b5 in this position, which was a bit surprising, but I thought maybe my opponent would go for it, because it was difficult to really find any active ideas for him at this point. But I really did have my doubts about this one, because to me it just looked like I was going to be winning a pawn, and I couldn't really see what my opponent's compensation really was. I thought in the game, like, his idea might have been to go rook e7 and then bring the rook to the b file and put a lot of pressure in this fashion, but I wasn't really too scared of this, to be honest. And what he ended up doing actually was completely different. after bishop takes b5, he ended up going bishop d7, trying to offer an exchange of pieces. But to be honest, I wasn't really too keen on exchanging the bishops, because even though, you know, like I'm up in material, and typically when you're up in material, the advice is to exchange down and simplify the position, I didn't feel it was that simple, because I actually thought they'd give Black's pieces a little bit more freedom to move around, and that now their pieces are maybe coordinating a little bit better. So what I actually came up with, and even though that's technically fine, is I actually decided on playing this move bishop e2. And my whole idea is basically just that this knight is still a really like awkward piece on e5, and by keeping my bishop on the board, I keep control of a lot of these squares. And like, for example, in this position, I can't trap the knight with f4 because they can just come to d3. In this position, f4 is a genuine threat now because, well, the knight cannot come to any of these squares, and it can't come back to d7 because, well, the bishop is occupying that square. And on that note, right, like one of the main concrete points is that, you know, after rook takes b2, in theory, I should just be winning after f4, but unfortunately, it's a lot more complicated than this. And I calculated this out during the game. I didn't just stop here and be like, I'm winning the piece. You know, you always have to look out for your opponent's resources. So I was looking at, like, you know, these knight g4 ideas, and I was like, okay, if they take, it's going to be knight takes g4. I take that again, bishop takes d3, and then I'm like, okay, I have a choice between knight c4 and taking on d7, followed by like rook takes d2, queen a4, and I'm like a piece up. Maybe they can grab like a pawn or two, but it didn't really seem too convincing to me. I was sure that it felt like there were so many of Black's pieces hanging, I should be doing well somehow, but in reality it was actually a lot more complicated, and I was not, I have a good position still, but it's not as winning as I thought it was. For example, after bishop takes e3, if I go bishop takes d7, which I think is the best move actually, rook takes d2, queen a4, like during the game I thought like all this stuff should be easily winning, but after rook takes e3, for example, well, okay, there's one thing to be said is my rook is actually hanging, and if I just go for a normal looking move like rook ad1, it's not as straightforward as I thought it was. Like, I thought I could maybe just you know, chill out here and should easily convert it, but the bishop comes to d4, and there's a lot of counterplay I sort of have to be careful with. King h1 maybe getting out of the bishop's square, and queen e7 actually, and again, it's not that simple. Rook e1 is going to be coming, this queen h4 ideas I have to watch out for. So it turned out that there's only really one move that keeps white's advantage here, and that's queen a8, forcing a trade. Not like, you know, the hardest move to see from this position, but from afar that's not really trivial. So in this position, it actually turned out after rook takes b2 that the simplest approach was to go bishop takes e5, and now if rook takes e5, of course, we're going to win an exchange. So probably the best move is d takes e5, but you know, Black never really wants to play d takes e5 unless they can get a knight to d6, blockading the d pawn very quickly, because in this sort of position we get a knight to c4, e4, and we have a very nice protected path d pawn, very nice positional advantage. Black's pieces have a tough time getting active, and maybe we can you know, pick up one of their weak pawns, for example. So very nice position, but definitely in the game not really what I was actually aiming for, and I was kind of a bit upset with myself afterwards. I didn't really calculate this whole mess of variations to perfection, but I guess perfection is maybe you could say unattainable. But yeah, after bishop e2, what ended up happening was my opponent, I guess, was a bit scared of all that stuff. He didn't play rook takes b2, he ended up playing queen e7, and basically the idea now was that if I play like some random move, sorry, no, let's say I play f4 rather, this is actually more to the point, he's gonna go knight d3 and basically just try and like attack stuff in our camp. And if we go bishop takes d3, the point is that queen takes, and now they are winning their pawn back and they're positioning much better. They have the bishop here, our pieces kind of look like shit, they're attacking everything, they're more active, not a position that you want to go for. I actually thought for a brief second I might be sort of trapping the black queen, because like if you notice, it doesn't really have too many squares. I think I missed d4 during the game, but I noticed at the very least that like they had rook e3, and yeah, like there's multiple reasons why this variation doesn't work. So what I ended up doing in the game was that instead of doing f4, I decided to play this move king h1 with the idea that now with f4 and knight d3, I can just take, and the queen can take on e3, but it's not going to be check. And my idea was still that if rook takes b2, I could probably play f4 and trap the knight. Unfortunately, again though, I wasn't really correct in some of my variations that I calculated. Namely that if I go f4 immediately, again knight g4, take, and I saw that queen takes e3 and he's sort of healing all of these pieces. But intuitively, I thought that like this should somehow work out for me, but it's actually very unclear after knight c4 takes, and I saw at the very least I have this, and you know I'm up an exchange, but maybe black is some compensation. It turns out more than enough compensation. Maybe I have to be careful. I just felt like surely there should be something, like at the very least I have this to bail out to, but there should be something better. I shouldn't really be bailing out to something like that in the first place because my position's better, but it turned out there was, but I didn't see it in the game, which was I have queen c1, first kicking the rook away, and now I go f4, and the point is now if knight g4 takes, well, my queen kicked, first of all, the rook off the second rank, where it attacks a lot of my pieces, and also after knight c4, now I am protecting this knight with my queen, and I should be doing pretty well. Okay, again, I was quite mad at myself afterwards. I just didn't really, I was very sloppy, let's say, with a lot of my variations I calculated. And one thing also, I think this first round I made a lot of weird calculations. I was, for example, looking at queen c2, a very natural looking move, and just sort of holding on to the extra pawn and sort of in the future preparing e4, f4, something like that maybe. But I was like, oh, there's bishop f5, e4, like, like weird knight takes e4 tactics, but this just doesn't work at all here. I think it's hard to say. I was maybe after, like basically when I was calculating these variations, this knight was like off the board somehow, which is obviously bad, but in this position that's just not the case. So I'm not really sure what I overlooked. Well, it's not really a matter of overlooking, it's just like something wrong with my visualization there, or calculation, whatever you want to call it. Very strange, right? But luckily I wasn't really punished, and my opponent did not play rook takes b2, he instead played g5. And as I was talking about earlier, right, like if you can meet g5 with f4, like that's really good, because if you can get them to sort of, like basically this transformation structure after takes is not good for black. It opens the e file, they weaken the structure. Like if they're going to play g5, they at least want to get g4, right? But this is just bad. Also, if they try to play knight g6 with the idea that, you know, if I take it, they at least get the e5 square. Well, it doesn't really work, because after f takes g5, the knight's just trapped actually, so they're just losing the piece. So my opponent ended up taking, and after takes, knight g6, I played f4 quite quickly, but after this point, like, I think my opponent and I both had around maybe just under an hour, but this move was my by far longest think of the game. I spent about half an hour, maybe a bit more than that. And the reason basically was that I realized there were certain problems with my position, you could say, maybe not objectively, but practically speaking, that I didn't really consider when I was playing f4, and only when we actually got this position on the board, my position ended up being a lot less straightforward, maybe you could say, than I initially thought it was. But like, yeah, if you want to take a bit of time to try and figure out what maybe you would play as white here, I'd suggest you try and do so. Maybe not the whole like half hour thing, but you know, just try and think about it a little bit, see what you come up with. But yeah, basically what I ended up playing in the game was this move, knight c4, and of course knight c4 is a like fairly obvious move. It's where you want to put your knight. But the real thing to think about is how are you responding to knight e4, because basically, you know, if this happens, well, you probably don't want to play knight takes d6, because then black gets, well, like probably two pieces. For the rook, you don't really want that. That's not very desirable. And if after queen takes e4, you don't go knight d6, it's sort of like, what are you doing, right? Because you can't go bishop f3, because then your knight on c4 hangs. If you go bishop d3, well then, you're just sort of hanging the pawn on d5, and I thought there should be some sort of discovery here, like maybe breakthrough of f5 or some shit like that, but it just basically doesn't really work. And black has a very, maybe not comfortable, but at least they're sort of in the game sort of position. So I definitely wasn't really too happy with those variations, you could say. And so for a while I was sort of thinking, like, do I even really want to play knight c4, right? I was also looking at, like, I think queen c2 to try and like protect b2 and then like bring a rook to e1 or something, but then I realized actually that black could just play knight takes d5, and it's very annoying to me, because if I take this now, my bishop on e2 hangs. I think I was also looking at some ideas like bishop d3, and in hindsight this one's actually kind of interesting, because you sack the b2 pawn, and knight c4, you gain some tempi, and maybe you're going to get f5 in, for example, like in this position. And now the point is, if knight e5, they can't comfortably recapture an e5 with a piece after either the bishop capture or the knight one. I'm not completely sure which one is better yet, but in either case, it doesn't look too great for black. I would expect knight takes e5, keeping the dark bishop on the board. This feels a little bit more principled. But okay, it turns out the best move is actually this one f5 that I accidentally put in the board just now. It's a very beautiful idea, actually. The idea being that after 95, you just play the simple move b3, and you give up control of the e5 square. But if you actually look at the position, black has no good ideas. It's very difficult for them to move, and white is just going to slowly bring all their pieces into like better positions. Maybe a bishop onto c4, queen c2, rook e1, maybe it's going to go to like a7 or something like that even. Very, yeah, again, just it's like just complete strategic domination, this idea. But the one I came up with, I think, is a little bit more practical maybe and easy to understand, which is I did play knight c4, but I ended up finding like a very concrete way to meet knight e4, which is I'm not going to take on e4 as I just showed earlier. I actually played bishop d3, and I gave up a pawn back, is similar to like the whole like bishop d3 here variations, kind of in a similar spirit, right? But this one I quite liked, the idea being that after knight e4, bishop d3, now after knight takes e3, which ends up happening in the game, I take back, he takes, and he wins a pawn back. But I calculated from afar that this was absolutely terrible for black, because now after f5, you know, your d6 pawn is actually being attacked now, and your knight is also being attacked, so the logical way to deal with both of those is knight e5. But now my whole point was that I'm just going to play f6 with tempo, and previously when the bishop was in g7, right, they would just take it, right? But now they can't really do that because the bishop is not in contact with the f6 square, because the knight is blocking it. And so that kind of forced like queen f8, but then with the pawn on f6, that really, and of course the passive queen, this whole position just looked absolutely awful to me, and I couldn't see like a clear like win, like when I was calculating that far from like this position, right? And I was looking at knight c4, but I was like, if I get the pawn to f6, I was pretty sure that that should just be awful. So when we got to this position, it was only now that I really started thinking about like, how do I absolutely murder them? And well, there were many actually tempting options, and the one I ended up going for was knight takes e5. I was also thinking about just like trying to snap off h7 immediately and trying to, you know, win a pawn like this. But to be honest, it just kind of seems wrong to make all these exchanges to me. I technically probably still am winning, but they can put up some resistance, and I didn't really like it so much. So what I ended up doing was after queen f8, I ended up playing knight takes e5. Now with the point that if bishop takes e5, I'm going into h5. I was also thinking at first maybe they're gonna go for example like d takes e5, but this is very ugly, and I'm going to, you know, do something like rook a7 maybe. They move the bishop. I can also go queen h5 first, and it's annoying for them because if they try to go like e4 for example, I can at the very least, like, you know, win the rook on b8. The chess-based program is also pointing out bishop d6 very nicely, and of course the point is if they take, then I just mate them. So because of that, I'm probably just winning their queen, and I guess that just speaks volumes to like how bad this position is, right? There's not really much black can actually do. They took, but you know, after queen h5, h6, I go rook a7, and maybe you would be tempted to like try and like shove a rook onto the g file or something, but I just couldn't see a clear entry, so I thought the best thing to do was use the whole board, go rook a7, and now if they like try to say like move the bishop away from being attacked, I can make use of the fact my rook is along here, and I can play bishop h7 check, and now the king is forced away from defending the f7 pawn. If they take, I take on f7. If they go king h8, I also take it, and either way it's going to be completely winning. So what ended up happening after rook a7 was takes h2, and I took, and you know, it's not going to last much longer. Again, bishop e5, my idea was to go check. In the game, he ended up trying rook e5, but like at the very least, I just go queen f3, and like your bishop's trapped. I could have won that, but I just went check instead. Rook g5, queen e4, and this is also pretty busted since I'm threatening mate, and also the bishop is sort of hanging. So in this position, my opponent resigned. And definitely, although, you know, my opponent's a few hundred points lower rated than myself, I know it was just nice. The whole game I fought, there's definitely some, you know, finer points in calculation where I was a little bit upset, even though these lines never actually occurred in the game. That from like afar, I just didn't calculate them so well. That's definitely like something which I can improve upon. Yeah, definitely it felt like the most important moment of the game was probably again like this one after, you know, this moment where knight g6 happened, and I basically spent like half an hour, went down to my last 30 minutes on the clock, and ended up playing knight c4, and basically after this just kind of played quite quickly. because like, you know, I took that one long think and it paid off very well because I got a win position out of it. He could have, after bishop d3, maybe gone f5. I was thinking this during the game, but I was like, okay, at the very least, I just take and go f5, right? a5, and I probably have some moves like this, and you can't really tell me like this position is good for black, for their whole kingside blown up, these active knights. Maybe at any moment we could take and get rid of their darksword bishop. I just don't see how this could possibly be good. But sort of zooming out for a second, taking a look at the rest of the board in round 1. Of course, I won on board 12, but there were some upsets. For example, international master Gary Lane losing to Aaron Lee, and there was some also upset draws that happened. But overall, like, you know, went as probably most people would expect. Yeah, all in all, while it wasn't exactly a perfect game, more or less pleased with how things went. And for round 2, I ended up being paired with the 5th seed, international master Stephen Solomon. One of the real OGs of Australian chess, you could say. He is known especially for his endgame grinding ability. But yeah, we will talk more about that next time. Hopefully that video will come out soon as well. But yeah, hope you guys enjoyed it. Like, subscribe, comment, whatever the usual stuff, and hope you guys have a good day.